Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. We're so excited that you are here. We're in the middle of our family circus teaching series where we've been talking about how the gospel intersects with the family. And there's so many different elements to look at, so many things in Scripture to look at. So we've been on that journey on Sundays, but also here on our weekly podcast where we're diving deep on some of the themes we've been talking about over the weekends and hopefully giving you some practical application steps in addition to the ones you got on Sunday throughout your week to follow Jesus, whether it's individually or with your family. So we're continuing our conversation today. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank. Welcome back. Happy Tuesday. Today's Tuesday. We're recording Tuesday.
Yep.
And also Michelle Myers, who is our Central Women's Discipleship Coordinator.
Yes.
Coming off of a couple of cool weeks. We just had an awesome women's night a couple weeks ago.
It was amazing.
Feel free to, anytime you want to just stop the conversation and share about that, feel free to do that. But so glad both of you guys are here today. We're going to be talking about conflict. Resolving conflict was the sort of the theme of the message last weekend. So before we go anywhere else with it, would love to just do some Sunday recap and ask both of you maybe what stood out from last weekend when it came to the message, worship, whatever it is.
So for me, it was besides the text, it was the reminder that the way that Ephesians is outlined and the way that you see so much in Scripture is before you get the imperative that God gives you, it's like do this, do this, do this. He gives you the indicative of what God has done. And so for 3 chapters in Ephesians, this is what God has done, this is what God has done, this is what God has done. And then he shifts and starts chapter 4. It's like in light of that, then this is the effect it should have as imitators of God. And then goes on. So it was a reminder again, if all you got is willpower, it's going to last till, Wednesday. And,
right.
And so, and that's not the danger, but that is the thing you have to remind yourself. The text this week's the same way. It's like if you don't ground it in what God has done, it ends up just being kind of moralism.
Doomed to fail.
Doomed to fail.
Yeah. You made a statement. You said grace is more powerful than harshness. And that stuck with me. And then the next morning, I was reading a chapter in the book I'm reading and it said, forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. And I was like, okay, I hear you, Lord. But it was just a reminder that so many times I think our logical response of what we think is true, when it disagrees with faith, we have to make the conscious effort to do what God has told us to do because he knows better.
Yeah, and to trust him. So, Pastor, one thing that you said on Sunday, just to kind of kick things off a little bit today, is that conflict is part of every close relationship. I think that was the statement. So what would you say separates people who deal with conflict effectively and people who don't deal with conflict effectively?
Sure. Well, I mean, and conflict can be a path road to intimacy for sure. I mean, you think of the people you love the most, because if you have no conflict, it typically is indicative of living parallel lives. And no intimacy, because you got 2 sinners, and if you actually live life together, you're going to butt heads, you're going to disagree. So it's like, how do you disagree? How do you have those conflict in a way that glorifies God? And if you do that, it is also good for you and your soul. And, again, conflict is going to happen, but I think the biggest, how do you there's some practical things you can do to think, okay, how do I not let this go? We were joking before we went on air about comedian Nate Bargatze and how he makes a joke about it, but the reason he's such an effective comedian is because it's real life.
That's
He'll
right.
take what is real. I mean, that's all comedians do that, where they say, okay, this is something you can relate to. And he talks about conflict in marriage and how 90% of them, he's like, 90% of those are dumb. He's like, 10% you call the cops. He said, but that 90% is dumb. And I think what happens is, if you just observe yourself and if you do church life long enough and you hear stories and you're like, so you're kind of the outsider a little bit listening in on people's lives sometime, and you're like, you're getting, you all are separated because of that.
Right.
Because of that. I mean, it literally, it is deeper than that, but typically it ends up with one or both of them not having the ability to, how do you let up something mostly minor, it ends up blowing them to something major. And there's a ton of ways that happens. But a lot of it is, when you look at it, I go back to my friend J.D. Greer's deal in his book, Gospel. That's always resonated with me. is the constant awareness. First I'm a sinner, and then second I've been sinned against, and just that posture tends to deflate it. Then it starts to segue into things like, Psalm 15:1. A harsh word stirs up anger, but a gentle word was a gentle word. How does it go? Harsh word stirs up anger, but a gentle word. I can't remember.
It's like turns away wrath.
It turns away wrath. Yeah. But you know that it's like if you say something to me, and if my first response to you is a little bit louder and a little bit defensive, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to win this argument, and I'm going to. Then it just keeps going louder and louder, and that's what you see. Unfortunately, if you can just have one of them, even like, just you can't avoid conflict, nor should you actually.
Right.
And just in any relationship, I mean, Jesus had plenty of conflict, but didn't let it spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Even like when he's kicking him out of the temple, he's not out of control. He's not flying around. He's in control, even though in that case, that's a great example of he was angry, but obviously did not sin. So
I heard somebody say one time, righteous anger leads to righteous action. That's how you know it's righteous anger, is that it leads you to righteous action.
I would say 90% of our anger, not 100%, 90% of our anger is not righteous.
That's right.
90% is not righteous. Now, there can be some anger, and we need to be angry about some things. Certainly need to be angry about some things. But when it comes to our family, maybe 10% is righteous. And, if let's say the anger a wife has or a spouse has for betrayal or that's righteous anger.
Right.
But if you look at it, like the book of James, which we'll study in the fall, talks about what is it that causes the fights and quarrels among you? Is it not that you want something and you don't have it? I mean, that's the unrighteous anger that is 90% of family conflict.
Self-driven.
Yeah.
Self-driven. I want something, I didn't get it. And so I'm going to fight for it. But there is a righteous part of that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with fighting for your marriage.
Right.
You're fighting for your prodigal. I mean, that's righteous. You just always have to be careful because we're sinners and we're bent that way. Even start off righteous. We can start off righteous and go unrighteous.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've heard a lot of people do sermons on it says to be angry. It's like, it is an imperative, but it's what they call permissive. That was kind of a learning deal. He's like, okay, you can be angry, but watch it. I mean, it's like kind of sin is right there.
Yeah.
And then he starts to list the sins.
Yeah, I think, we all want conflict to be fixed, but the reality of it is to fix it, you have to face it.
That's a good
and
one.
You have to deal with it.
Yep.
And so if you think that you do a good job with conflict because you avoid it, there's probably just a lot. You talked about it on Sunday of a lot that is happening under the surface. And so there's a stat that came out. I cannot remember what it is, but the shocking thing about it is that most friendships, most relationships don't have conflict because when there is a conflict, people just find a new friend instead. Like instead of dealing with the conflict. And if we want real relationships, we have to face the things that are holding us back from the intimacy that we want.
That's a great word.
A gentle answer turns away wrath, and a harsh word stirs up anger.
That's
There
it.
it is.
Finally,
Boom.
70.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's happening more and
You
more.
grabbed it.
Can't remember.
It's back there somewhere,
It
though.
isn't it? It's way
Yep,
back in
yep.
the recesses. I would say Rolodex, but half the people listening wouldn't know what a Rolodex is.
Yeah. So would love to hear from you guys both. What are some of the way to say it, what are some of the hard lessons that both of you have learned about conflict in your own life, whether that's marriage, parenting, work relationships, maybe some of the difficult things that you've picked up along the way that you'd love to help people not have to pick up the hard way in their own life.
Okay, so
You just got to grit your teeth and go for
I
it.
know.
Yeah.
Here it is. So anger is an easy emotion and it's a strong emotion. And so it is one that if you don't like to appear weak, you will default toward even when you're not actually angry, but when you feel hurt. And so you will mask your hurt with anger as a way to appear strong.
Yeah.
And if you are trying to overpower the other person in the relationship, that is the antithesis of what we're supposed to do when we deal with each other. And it does not work. It doesn't work. And so if you know, hey, anger is like my go-to emotion, then maybe you just need the reminder, like I do, that you're probably trying to mask something else. And so be vulnerable in your relationships to tell people when they've hurt you instead of just trying to be the strong one with anger.
Convicting.
Yeah, why don't you jot that down for both of us? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
What
was your question again?
Hard lessons you've learned. Yeah, we were both so like, man, that was good. Hard lessons you've learned about conflict.
Well, I mean, I know I'm an arguer. I mean, I feel like I can out-argue. You know,
Yeah.
I can win this argument, but I've learned that if I win the argument, especially family, I win the argument, I lose the war.
Yeah.
I mean, I lose the big picture. So one of the things I mentioned, just realizing, hey, especially family, we're on the same team.
Yes.
We're on the same team. So the goal is not to win the argument, because it takes a while to learn that if you're kind of a competitive person that feels like they can, you know, that they are right. I mean, that's what's scary is you actually do think you're right all the time.
Yeah.
And so definitely learned that. Learned, you know, that if you're acting outside of what your normal character is, then it's often something you hadn't dealt with. Kind of it's a little mixture of what we talked about in staff meeting today, and even the examples, like when you see, when you see somebody blow up over something small, you're like, it's not that, it can't be that thing, because it's just not big enough. You know, it's not big enough. So typically it's just like, what is going on with you? Why are you so, I mean, you were on, you were on edge. And I was, I'm looking at, like, if you take everybody thinks it's real flowery if you've been to a wedding, but, it talks about the 1 Corinthians passage, 1 Corinthians 13 passage about love. And when you go to that list, it's everybody thinks it's a brutal passage, because you're like, not me. And it's like when you walk in the room, it talks about love, and it talks about love is patient, love is kind. So if you ask yourself the question, when you walk in a room, do you bring in patience and kindness? I don't. If you were to just don't answer this, but you probably have not used those descriptors for me. Don't agree. I'm just kidding. It
was just I'm just saying, it was like right in the middle.
But it's very flat line. So that's what I would say is you've learned. Number one, it masks, if you're not careful, stuff that you hadn't dealt with. Kind of a little bit take of what Michelle was saying. And it goes back to that staff meeting where we talked about if you hold stuff on. And that stat I'm still kind of thinking about is, for those that are listening, a study showed that the average person loses 7 relationships in their significant. The average person loses 7 significant relationships in their life. And the average pastor loses 7 significant relationships every year. And I thought, if you don't know how to deal with that, it will eat you up.
Oh, yeah.
And then it starts to affect your other relationships, which is the biblical definition of bitterness.
Yeah.
And there are tons of bitter preachers. I mean, there are. I mean, they can mask it well, but there's a lot of angry guys. I understand. You don't want to be that guy.
Yeah, fueled by that.
It's true.
So I think we talked about this a good bit on Sunday, that a lot of conflict can be traced back to communication, lack of communication. It's not necessarily what starts the conflict, but it's what accelerates that conflict into an unhealthy space. So maybe some principles for how you would separate healthy communication versus unhealthy communication when it comes to conflict.
Oh, when you said on Sunday, talking about watch out for your inner attorney, I might have gotten an elbow in my ribcage.
Well, he wasn't supposed to elbow. Yeah.
Well, he might have a reason to, because basically sometimes I know that if I just go with what my flesh is going to say, all that's missing from my arguments is ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Like that's the only thing that's missing.
Yeah.
And there's no place for that, because like you are on the same team. And even if you come up with the statement that, wins in the moment, gosh, if the relationship loses, everybody loses.
And it doesn't work. I mean, if you just talk about it, anytime I've laureated an argument, I don't remember there ever being a time when she, right then in the moment, goes, you know what? Now that you've enlightened me to how smart you are and how lucky I am to actually have you as a husband, then you know what? I was wrong. That has not happened before.
No.
Now, she's awesome that sometime in the, later on down the road, but I'm saying in the moment, it never, ever works.
Yeah.
And so just communication skills, just realizing, again, same team, attack the problem, not the person.
Right.
Then there's some basic ones. How does that flesh itself out? You always, again, those things, they inflame it.
Right.
And so the question is, am I going to put gas on this fire? Because conflict is no fun. And I would say, I can't speak on behalf of, I don't want to gender it, but I'm saying, I know generally speaking, men would almost rather have peace than the conflict, and the conflict is necessary at times. Because sometimes a guy will not, if a guy's pulling away, he would almost rather have peace than what is needed to be intimate, which sometimes is conflict, or at least kind of chewing on some of the stuff that is, if your family is not where it needs to be, that it's probably conflict is necessary. But again, just peace is not always awesome, because again, peace can be a symptom of just a corporation, of a family that's actually acting like a corporation. She does, especially when you have kids. When you have small kids, and you're basically everything from a coach to a carpool to a cook to all that kind of stuff. And if you're not careful, you can blink and 5 years goes by, and you all hadn't had a just beneath the surface conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if I've told this story on here before or not, but when we were doing premarital counseling before we got married, I remember the counselor was like, when you get into conflict, and you will, one great principle you can use is you say, I'm hearing you say this, and that's making me feel this. So we got that advice, and I kind of rolled my eyes. And then after we got married, our first fight, I don't even remember what it was about. Ashley brought that out. She said, I'm hearing you say this, and it's making me feel this. And I got so mad, to my shame. I got so mad because what it basically unveiled was that she was actually looking for reconciliation, and I just wanted to win the argument, and I would have been standing up there in first place looking down, and there's no one else down there to celebrate, but it's real,
It's good, yeah.
Even if you have the principles, there's still that, oh man,
well,
you just want to win.
And that skill that you just mentioned is good, because I'm hearing you say this. Number one, you might not have heard it right, and then number two, it shows them you are listening to them.
Yeah.
And then when you say, I feel this way versus you did this, or you never, or you're never home, or you always, that does, most people just get, I don't always. Remember the time 3 weeks ago? I was actually home on time, or whatever that is. So that's good. Very good.
So we're really walking right into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is how does listening play a part in conflict, particularly active listening?
I mean, I think listening is how we have empathy and how we understand where the other person is instead of just planning what we're going to say or getting absorbed with what we feel. That is how you come to the same team, because if we're on the same team, I need to know how my actions are affecting you, how this is making you feel, because otherwise I'm just trying to make all of the assumptions based on only what I know. And so we do have to be really good listeners, and not just listeners because that's like what we're supposed to do, but because we care about what the other person is feeling.
Yeah.
And again, not to be too stereotypical, but stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason.
Yeah.
But I know I have to ask sometimes, when it goes to husband, wife, is she sharing this for me to fix it or to feel with her? Because those are two entirely different things. I'm a fix-it guy, and it took me 10 years to learn that. And I'm like, well, let me fix it. That's, and it would just escalate. And finally it's like, she knows how to fix it. Yeah. She just wants a partner with this thing.
Right.
And it took forever. It's still the default is fix it. But I think I've learned a little bit on, listen, she wants somebody to partner, kind of get up under there and take the load with her, not tell her how to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, my name is Clay Carino, and when I was 19 years old, I came to faith in Jesus. Growing up, I had a concept of God. I believed that there was one, but I thought he was like an angry judge. I could never appease him or please him, and it led to all kinds of different brokenness in my life, whether it be looking for approval, addictions, or just depression and anxiety. And it wasn't until I was 19, through the influence of some friends and reading the Gospel of Matthew on my own time, that I saw that Jesus wasn't who I thought he was, that he was gracious and kind, and that yes, I was deserving of judgment from God, but that in Jesus there was grace available to me. And Jesus didn't come to the world to condemn the world, but to save it. And so at 19, I turned from my sin, put my faith in Jesus, and my life has never been the same. He changed the trajectory of my life. And over time, he's slowly changed me to look more like himself. And now I have a hope and a future. And like I said, my life has completely changed.
So a couple avenues here to kind of walk down for a few minutes. One of them is anger, which we've kind of circled around a little bit today. You spent some time talking about dealing with anger on Sunday, and to use your language, how do we avoid making sure we're not nursing our anger, that we're dealing with it in a way that's effective and appropriate?
I mean, honestly, the key the key of the text, I think, there's some things that go around it, be tenderhearted, but the key is in the last verse, it says, forgiving each other just as Christ has forgiven you. So to me, the key to, if you're going to be an angry person, there's been something that has been nursed for a long time, or not necessarily a long time. It can be a bit long enough to fester, because everybody's going to get hurt. Again, I can take it back to, I think I mentioned in one service, like there was a buddy of mine, he was helping somebody, I think there was an abandoned house and they were taking stuff out. And he had some wood and he got was just taking wood out, got a little cut on his arm.
Right.
But the wood that he got cut by was like, had a bunch of bacteria and all this stuff in it. Long story short, that tiny little cut, he just looked at it and a couple of days later it was all red and then it started getting, puffy and all that kind of stuff. He finally goes to the doctor and he's like, basically, if you'd have waited a little bit longer, you could have lost that arm. And this is a guy in perfect health.
Yeah.
And I thought that's the way that wounds work. Now they can. I think it was Crawford that put it this way. Everybody's going to get wounded, and his thing was you never want to hire a person who still is nursing that wound, because he said they'll live and they'll platform, their identity will be in that wound. So you're just going to talk about your wound and how you get people to talk about your wound and all that kind of stuff. But he said what you want is somebody that's taken the wound and God used it for a season of brokenness. Brokenness meaning, okay, God crushed you with that, but or allowed that, but then he has built you back up. And so now it's the old thing is now your mess that you had is now a message. So all the stories we see, like the story we even saw Sunday, that was a mess that now is a message of how God can break a stronghold and God's grace and all that stuff. So, I forget exactly where I was going, but it was like, but angry people are people that have something that happened. Typically, it is festered there. They don't even know it sometimes. But I think it's, I can't remember the passage in Hebrews. It says, "Do not let a root of bitterness, bitterness spring up among you." But then the scary part, it says, "and defiles many," meaning that bitterness / anger, because all bitterness, the word for bitterness is pointed or to cut. And it does. It cuts you on the inside, but it also defiles many. So when people, let's just take somebody who's going through a painful divorce. If somebody's going through a painful divorce, regardless of the circumstances, if there's not been some kind of forgiveness, and again, forgiveness is not a lot of things. It's not enabling, it's not trusting, it's not even reconciliation necessarily, all those things. It's releasing somebody from a debt. But if you don't do that, it just stays in there and nurses, and then it affects, if you get remarried, it affects that one. And that's why they're like, you're having the same issues in the second marriage you did in the first, is because some of that hurt got transferred over. So again, and sometimes it's stuff you've learned growing up. Psychologists call it transference. Basically, you saw your mama or your daddy do this a certain way. They were angry people, so you just you got the same way. But for me, most of it is a wound that has never been touched by the gospel, and it just sits there. And it's not like you do it one time and it's done. Even every time any forgiveness is in a message, I'm always kind of thinking back, okay, is there one? And it's usually I've forgiven somebody, but you got to go back and remember you forgave. Yeah. It's like, all right. You haven't if if you're rehearsing what they did in your mind, if you are thinking about, ways that God might judge them. If you're thinking, if you go past a place that maybe you used to go eat with them at or something like that, and it kind of, you feel your blood pressure go up a little bit. Those are unhealthy emotions that are kind of telling you there's something on the inside that's not quite cleaned out yet.
Yeah. The passage you read this morning had that section in there where Paul's talking about being injured by somebody, and he doesn't just forgive him. He says, "I hope it's not held against them," which is that's a different level of forgiveness to say. Right. Not just like they are going to be judged. But remember
what he say with Alexander the coppersmith. He says he basically gives him. He goes, "The Lord will judge him," but with his friends, he's like, "Lord, don't bring a charge against them." So there was almost like kind of two. One was stuff that happens every day. One was like deep stuff, but he's like, it's kind of like what we talked about. Is Sunday is like every person that hurts you, either Jesus will pay for their sins like he has yours, or they will pay for their sins in eternity if they never come to Jesus. So either way, justice will be served.
Yeah,
that's very helpful.
But yeah.
And I think Paul was quick in his warning. And I think so many times what we do is we vent and we mask it even as like an abundance of counsel. But if you think about Matthew 18 and how it tells us when we have conflict, we're supposed to go directly to that other person, because I know in the times when I allow myself to vent, all that happens is I get more justified in my anger, and my inner attorney really comes out, and I am really prepared for that argument, which is not healthy, not good. And so don't allow yourself to vent a whole lot to a bunch of different people, especially to people that are not going to point you back to Jesus and to point you towards forgiveness, to point you towards reconciliation if you is possible. I would tell, if we're talking about, because I think venting does nurse the anger, and it makes it seem even more real, especially when somebody else agrees with me. You agree.
Get them
Hey,
on
I've
your
been
side.
wronged. You know, so.
Well, and that's kind of the spiral, the downward spiral of Paul's list there at Ephesians. You know, he starts talking about bitterness, which is kind of internal, but then he starts going out, clamor, malice. And so all of a sudden you're getting people on your side. Hey, did you know what this person did to me? And and then they either validate you. So it takes a strong friend to go, hey, this isn't helping you any.
That's right.
This isn't
No place
helping
for
you.
that.
It
That's
takes
right.
a strong friend. Sometimes that friend's a Holy Spirit. And sometimes that's just a good friend that loves you more than wants to be liked by you.
That's right.
You know, it'll haunt you in the best way is, you know, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. He's like, hey, you've heard it said, you shall not murder. If you murder, you're going to be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who slanders his brother will be liable to judgment.
That's
he
right.
ups the ante in a way.
Oh, 100%. So anytime you drive down Highway 26, you have to quote that verse to yourself.
That's why I have it ready, because it's just cycling every day.
It's ready.
There's people listening that will not put a Biltmore Church sticker on their truck because they don't want to be held accountable.
Yeah. And I would just say that Michelle and I both don't drive trucks, if that helps narrow the list down.
I have one on the back of mine. I used to have it on the mirror, though, or on the window that would slide over and you couldn't see it.
You could always roll it down before you cut somebody off.
Got to.
Yeah, that's real. So maybe for the people listening and watching, who I want to recognize there are people who are dealing with really heavy conflict and really heavy wounds. This stuff that's like, I don't understand. This is way too painful. How am I supposed to, try to forgive them? What would you counsel people who are dealing with just the weightiness of that?
Again, I would say right now, when it comes to conflict, just because it does open up a lot, if you're not safe, get safe. So if we're talking about conflict, if there's a person in your home that is out of control and physically in any way threatening, if you're a man that bows up on his family and flexes on his family physically, you're a wicked, wicked man, and you need to repent, and you might need to spend a little time in jail. And don't feel, and it's not wrong if you're in that situation to call the police. Being a Christian, and sometimes abusers like that will use the Christian faith against a person is like, well, you forgave me. Well, again, forgiveness doesn't mean enabling you to physically harm somebody. So again, you can forgive, but somebody might need to go to jail. So with that being said, but sometimes we got an email from somebody actually Sunday afternoon about how do I forgive somebody, they hurt me really bad. I think it was an uncle or something, but they're dead. And that's a great question. I would say a couple of resources real quick. It's an old book called The Gift of Forgiveness by Charles Stanley.
Okay.
Has a great chapter at the end about how do you forgive somebody who actually has already passed away. Because he had to do that, if I'm not mistaken, maybe to his stepdad or something like that. And he actually put a chair, he talked about how he put a chair. His stepdad was dead and gone, but just I do find with forgiveness there is something to be said to do something physical to mark it down, kind of like a memorial stone. But in his case, he put a chair there and said, because of what Jesus has done for me, I release you from that debt. But I would say it is key on forgiveness real quick is to name what happened. It's not denying it. It's to name what happened. And then release it. You don't owe me that. But again, that doesn't mean you go back to the situation, doesn't mean there's a lot of misunderstandings about forgiveness. But again, the deep hurt, the reason we don't want to forgive because we're like, it's too big. But that doesn't make sense because it's really God's way. It's God's way to relieve you from that as much as anything. You're not letting the offender off the hook.
Right.
If you understand forgiveness. And so when people say it's too big, I can't forgive it, that's actually, it's like self-defeating because that's God's gift to you for relational failure to be able to release that and in some ways release it to God. God will take care of that. either now or later, but God misses nothing.
That's
so
right.
the deep stuff, and obviously there's some counseling that can be done. There's some professional help, pastoral help, all those things. It is good not to, again, people who are wounded, it's like I go back to the Animal Planet all the time, are the ones that, who do the lions pick off? They pick off the ones outside of a herd. They get, so what are the herds? The herd takes the wounded and they try to put them in the middle of the herd to protect them from the predators. And that's why, the Bible talks about how he's like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He picks off wounded people who are not in a herd. The herd for people is a church. And sometimes people have had church hurt. We have a lot of people that have had church hurt. Yeah. And what we want to do is kind of put you in the middle of the herd and get you healed up, put you around some safe people, not perfect people, but good people that love you, kind of bring you, bring you along as God heals that. And it won't heal overnight.
Right.
But it will heal over time.
Yeah.
Yes and amen.
Yeah, well said. So let's talk about being parents and modeling this a little bit. Both of you are parents. And so I'd love to hear how you'd recommend for parents listening, watching, that they can help model some of this Christ-like behavior for their children, even in the middle of family conflict.
Wow. Apologize to your kids when you get it wrong, because you're going to. And so I think one of the most powerful ways that parents can demonstrate the gospel to their kids is by being the first to apologize when you mess up.
Yep.
And so don't make the kid to apologize to you when they do something wrong and not reciprocate it. Be the first repenter in your home and watch how your kids, I think you said it one time, maybe the first year that we were here, you were preaching on parenting and you talked about how kids don't, it's not that kids don't like coming to church, it's that kids don't like hypocrisy. They don't like hearing things in scripture that they don't see modeled by their parents during the week. And so model the gospel for your kids by apologizing when you mess up.
Yeah, because they don't need Superman or Supermom. Yeah. They need, by their parents, to show that, hey, mom and dad, they need a savior as well.
That's right.
And that's where, hey, dad messed up. And to be honest, I know for the first 10 years of being a parent, that's to my failure. I don't ever remember apologizing. But I had a deal in my mind, not that I didn't make mistakes, I'm saying, but in my mind, I'm thought, okay, I'm supposed to be this. And so if I admit this was a failure, then it was, for some reason, it was just after a while, I kind of learned how to do that. But that would be one of the things that should be easy. Hey, daddy overreacted. I'm sorry about that. Even, hey, will you forgive me for that? Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I think you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, but when Crawford Loritz was here with us while you were out, he spoke to our staff, and one of the things he said about parenting, he said, perfect parents don't raise perfect children, they raise legalistic ones. And he went back to that whole thing about apologizing and kind of the effects of that.
And he probably talked, there are no perfect parents. Yeah. So what legalism does is legalism tries to put an outside veneer of perfection, but the people close to you, like your kids, they see through that.
They know.
They know.
Yeah.
They know.
Yeah.
They know.
That's very helpful. So another venue that we haven't gotten into much today is work. Work conflict is another part of this. So I wanted to see if there's anything, and maybe there's not, but if there's anything different or unique you'd say about people who are navigating conflicts at work versus in their families, things like that. Any thoughts?
I think I would just remind those of you who are in the secular workplace, which is a mission field where God has you, to remember that if people know that you are a Christian, if you will take some of those, because I think a lot of times in the workplace, you're supposed to cover your mistakes up. And if you will be countercultural in the workplace, and if you will apologize, even if you're like, man, that person punched me in the face and I gave them a paper cut, still, you are the leader if you're the believer in that relationship, even if that person is your boss. Right. And so apologize first, have humility, be known for being different in your workplace in that way.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I mean, I echo what she said. I mean, you are, again, never underestimate. That's your calling. I mean,
that's
vocation, right. I think it was the Latin word for voca is vocation, which is the idea of calling. So just to reinforce, if you work 50 hours a week at wherever, that is a huge part of your calling on your life. And you are like God's man or God's woman in that place. And more than likely, unless you work in a church or, we don't have Christian bookstores anymore, but, some, a Christian organization, you were surrounded, you're on the mission field. And even if you're 90% right, I mean, but 10% wrong, own the 10%.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? Sorry about this. I should have done this. Because without a doubt, there's some tough bosses out there.
Right.
But again, you're God's alternative in that place. It was one last to encourage. I think it was in the staff meeting a little while ago. It brought up to mind that there was a person. That somebody was sharing a story of God at work and how they've been praying for this person for a super, super, super long time, and didn't see any tangible fruit. But when that guy's life bottomed out, they ran to him.
That's right.
And that's what I always want to remind you. You might be the praying lady at church or at work, and you're like, I'm not making a difference. I'm not making a difference. But a lot of times, I mean, who are they going to run to when the bottom falls out? They're not going to run to the guy that's just like them. I'm going to go to the praying lady. I'm going to go to the guy that actually has, not in a self-righteous way, but has invited me to church or expressed care for my family, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So be encouraged.
Yeah. So maybe to wrap up this way, what would be anything maybe that you haven't shared yet, or you just want to reinforce some of those practical, what are some things that we can do as followers of Jesus to make sure that we're handling conflict his way and not our way? Any last minute practical things maybe we haven't talked about yet?
I think just to be aware, the more you talk, the more you're probably going to have to apologize.
Yeah.
And so,
If you talk for a living or just talking general?
just talking general.
Yeah.
Just in general in your relationships
and
and whatever.
proverb or two
there's
about
a few.
that one.
And so just be aware. And so maybe if you're working on this, maybe you say less.
Yeah. Maybe say, listen, what James talks about, be slow to speak, quick to listen. That's always great to listen more than you talk.
Yeah. One thing, if I can jump in here, that's helped me a lot is if I take time in my own life when it comes to praying, for me that looks like in the morning generally, if I'm consistently confessing and repenting of things that I'm seeing in my own life, I'm much quicker to forgive in the lives of others around me. And it goes back to that JD quote, but for me it's a practical, it's not just an idea about being first a sinner, but I've got to recognize and own that I'm a sinner first, sin against second.
For sure.
Okay, that was very helpful. I'm encouraged. I'm very confident that people listening and watching are going to be encouraged by the treasure trove. I can't even say that. Treasure trove. Sound like the Princess Bride. How about the wealth of wisdom that both of you have shared over the last 30 minutes or so. Thanks for taking the time and for seeking the Lord and for helping us deal with conflict in our own lives. I appreciate it. I know to speak on behalf of a lot of people listening that I get to interact with from time to time, that our people feel that way as well. So thank you both. Looking forward to jumping back into Family Circus this weekend.
Yes.
Anything you want to say about where we're going, or you just want to?
No, we're gonna be in Family Circus again, and then we'll have before Easter going to do 4 weeks in the Book of Jonah.
Yeah.
We're in a year called if you don't go to our church, we're in a emphasis just the year of one. Like, who's your one? We want to be one church, lifting up one name to reach one more. And so that'll help us, because in the Book of Jonah, you got the prophet who does not obey God, but the pagans do. So it's convicting as well. But Family Circus this week.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you this Sunday at one of our campuses. We cannot wait to worship with you. Thanks for joining us today. As always, you are loved and sent.